The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Identity is never simple, but for Indigenous people, this country amplifies the complexity. Tonight, two cases in point. First, we'll speak to author and advocate Lynn Gehl about her decades-long quest for official recognition of her status, denied under the Indian Act. Then, after some high-profile incidents of Indigenous ancestry falsely claimed, we're asking, what defines Indigeneity? It's Tuesday, November 23rd, and that's all next on The Agenda. Imagine having to spend more than 2 decades in court fighting the Canadian government to reclaim your legal identity. That is what author, artist, and advocate Lynn Gehl did, because certain provisions in the Indian Act denied her Indigenous status. Her new book chronicles the arduous journey as defended in that landmark case. It's called Gehl versus Canada, Challenging Sex Discrimination in the Indian Act, and it brings Lynn Gehl to our airwaves tonight from Peterborough, Ontario. Lynn, it's great to meet you. How are you doing tonight?
Good. Thank you for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. I just want to start with the title of your book, which is very stark. Gehl versus Canada. Did it feel sometimes during this journey like you were taking on the whole country?
Yes. Initially, the court case was called Gehl versus the Queen. Yes. Yes. Certainly, you know, the Department of Justice has deep pockets. They have a $500 million budget and a staff of 5,000, and then there's just me. So yes, I did.
For years, you tried to get status as a member of the Algonquin of Pikwakanagan First Nation. How come, or how did you come not to have that status in the first place?
So I inherited sex discrimination. It was an intergenerational inheritance. My great-grandmother was removed from Pikwakanagan in the 30s with her children, my grandmother being one of them, because of issues around sex discrimination. Because her lineage came through, well, her husband, his lineage came through, oh, terrible, through his mother line. So his name was Joseph Gagne, and my great-grandmother was Annie Jane Maness. They were both Indigenous from Pikwakanagan, and they were removed because of issues of sex discrimination in the Indian Act.
Well, in fact, you shared a letter that your great-grandmother received in January of 1945, and we're going to put a photo up of it right now, and it reads, "Dear Madam, I am in receipt of a copy of your letter recently sent to the Indian Affairs Branch, Ottawa, with regard to your status as an Indian. In reply, I wish to inform you that you are not an Indian as defined by the Indian Act. At the time of your marriage to Joseph Gagnon, a white man, any rights you had as an Indian of the Golden Lake Band ceased, and you became a white woman." And then, pathetically, it signed yours very truly, H.P. Ruddy, Indian agent. Just talk about the impact that a letter like that would have had on your great-grandmother.
I never had the opportunity to meet my great-grandmother. I know that when I received it in the mail from an archivist, it floored me, like really floored me. I'm happy that you read it and you didn't ask me to read it, because it's a pretty emotional letter.
But what's or I guess not interesting, what it demonstrates is that men don't lose their status if they, quote unquote, marry out, but women do. Have I got that right?
Well, that was prior, prior to 1985, that was the case. And now you don't lose status or gain status through marriage. They changed that in 1985. And then they also, of course, incorporated new forms of sex discrimination in the Indian Act in 1985.
Talk about that. What does that mean?
Sure. So in terms of Gehl versus Canada, I'll just limit my discussion to there. So prior to 1985, they had I'm going to call it a wonderful provision that protected children of unknown and unstated paternity. When the man or the father wasn't known, the child was a status Indian like the mother. But in 1985, what they did is they secretly took that out and became, the Indian Act became silent on that very matter. And then at the level of policy and practice within in the Department of Indian Affairs, they were harming those children. They were ruling or making decisions that in essence meant the man was a white man, and then these children were being denied their Indian status registration. So that's what happened in 1985. There's other forms of sex discrimination that were created as well. But what's really disturbing about that situation is it's often said that the Indian Act was amended in 1985 to bring it in line with the Charter, and it just completely failed to do that. And actually, what happened was the legislative change opportunity became an opportunity to create new forms of sex discrimination, which is horrific.
Well, the Charter came in 1982, so we're talking about just a few years after that. Why do you think it was, in spite of the Charter apparently being applied here, why do you think it didn't work?
I think it was an intentional strategy on the part of Canada to obfuscate and disguise new forms of sex discrimination. And
how old were you when you started this battle for your status?
So I was only in my 20s, around the time of 1982 and 1885, and now I'm pushing 60. So it's, long time.
Indeed. No, this is clearly something that has been of crucial interest to you. Maybe you could tell us why it was so important to you that you've spent so much of your life on this.
Sure. So I don't know if it was an interest, but certainly I was motivated. I think it was the amendment to the Indian Act in 1985. It made me realize that my grandmother and my father were potentially entitled to Indian status registration, and I needed to do something constructive with my life. I was, in my 20s, and I think I was really outraged when I realized that the Indian Act was amended to actually, in a way that created new forms of sex discrimination, even though we had this charter. So I was horrified that Canada was doing that, and I just took on the activity.
Indeed, you did. Well, let me read an excerpt from the book, and then we'll come back and chat after I do this. You write, I grew up not knowing who I was or what my place was within the Canadian mosaic. The contradiction was that I secretly knew I was an Algonquin. As a young person, I spent many years in critical contemplation of what was happening around me. You see, through processes of policy and legislation, my father, his mother, who is my kokomis, my great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother, and I were denied who we were and are. Okay, let's unpack this. First of all, kokomis, what does that mean?
Grandmother in the Anishinaabe Moen.
Okay, very good. Did not having status preclude you from being able to return to your First Nation in any way?
Yes, it precluded my father and my grandmother and myself and my great-grandmother, so it was generational. Yes, it did. Because I was a non-status Algonquin person, I wasn't allowed to be a member of Pikwakanagan First Nation, and of course that was a barrier. Politically, it was a barrier. So now I am a status registered Indian and Pikwakanagan accepted me as a member. I'm so grateful that they accepted me as a band member. And now because I am a band member, I'm allowed to, I'm permitted to sit more centrally in the process of the Algonquin land claim process in Ontario. So as a non-status person, I was more marginal.
So for how many years were you, if you like, culturally prohibited from engaging with your First Nation?
How many years? I was born into it.
You were born into it. So it's essentially
yes.
all you knew until you eventually won.
It was an exile. It was an exile that I inherited from my father, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother because of sex discrimination in the Indian Act.
Now, were you physically able to return to your First Nation territory?
Well, I have a vision disability, right? Like a lot of Indigenous people, we have a higher rate of disability, so I don't drive very well. And then there's, I was born into poverty and violence and danger. And, my beginning of my life was more about survival. Although in my early life, my father did take me to Golden Lake, and he introduced me and made sure that I knew who my ancestors were, who my cousins were, and who it was interesting. He was teaching me my kinship relations, I think, for ontological purposes. He really wanted me to know who I was as an Algonquin person, even though he wasn't allowed to be an Algonquin person. And while we were there, we would fish in the lake, but we weren't allowed to. We were doing it illegally.
And where is Golden Lake, incidentally?
Highway 60 in between Algonquin Park and the city of Ottawa.
Very good. Okay. Now, in your case, your status was denied because your father didn't know his paternity. Maybe you could give us some of the details around how that happened.
Sure. So, traditionally women had babies, and women had the jurisdiction of the Eastern Doorway. Women didn't have to be married. That was a traditional way. So, as I said, prior to 1985, there were protective provisions for the children of unknown and unstated paternity, where the child would be an Indian, just like their mother. But in 1985, they removed that and became silent on it. So, in my journey of moving through the court system, I really didn't know what they were going to do about the situation of my unknown grandfather. And what they ended up doing was they made a decision that had the effect of assuming he was a white man. So that meant that my father had a lesser form of status and he couldn't pass it on to me.
Now, I suspect a lot of people watching this have heard about the famous five, which admittedly goes back 100 years, but was a significant marker in the history of Canada in terms of women's rights. But we now have the Indigenous Famous Six. And in fact, let's show a picture. There they are. Who are they?
So that's Senator Lillian Dick, Senator Sandra Lovelace, that's Lynn Gehl, Sharon McIver, Jeanette Laval, and Yvonne Bedard. And
you have become the Indigenous Famous Six because why?
Well, along my way of learning how to read and write, I realized I had to do something constructive to keep the idea in the collective consciousness. And so, I studied critical theory and I understand counter-hegemonic devices. So what I did is I created what's known as the Indigenous Famous Five. And I did that for strategic reasons. And I wasn't a member. And then as we were moving forward with Bill S3, FAFIA, the Feminist Alliance for International Action, they created the Indigenous Famous Six, and they added me to it. So it's really a political strategy, a counter-hegemonic strategy to give the ideology currency regarding the issue of sex discrimination.
Now, Famous Five works, of course, because it's got a nice alliteration. Once you got added and it became Six, did you think of changing the name to the Sensational Six or something like that?
I don't feel that sensational. I don't really feel that famous, but that's nice for the chuckle. Initially, they were just going to do the Famous Five and add me to it. They were going to use contemporary people who were still alive. And then I said, well, we can't really exclude Yvonne Bedard. This process is all about disenfranchisement, and we can't leave her out. So they actually expanded it to include her, and I'm happy about that.
Good. Now, you mentioned in the last answer Bill S3, S meaning it came out of the Senate. What was that bill supposed to do?
Well, we were hoping, the Indigenous Famous Six, that it would eliminate all the sex discrimination and meet the 6-1A all the way concept that where Indigenous women and Indigenous men and their descendants born before 1985 were treated equally as 6-1A. Unfortunately, it failed to do that, but it was later resolved through an order in council.
And did the bill get passed to your satisfaction?
The order in council was great. It was great. And it was interesting because I think Canada was pressured to address 6-1A all the way because the Sharon McIver case was heard at the United Nations level, and the United Nations said, you have to meet 6-1A all the way.
And 6-1A is what?
6-1A all the way is like a subsection of the Indian Act that essentially means treat all the women and all the men and their children the same, born before 1985.
Gotcha. We're going to do another bit of numerology here, and that is when you, sort of circling back here to your case in which you use the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 15, is that the section of the Charter that you used to help your case?
Yes, it is. We were moving along. We were told we had to take a charter challenge, Section 15, to the Indian Act and Section 6. And so that's what we did. That's what we were prepared for, because the Indian Act did discriminate based on sex and race. And then, but then in the end, so many years later, what they decided to do, the Court of Appeal, is they ruled on administrative law. And they ruled that there is some circumstantial evidence that her unknown grandfather might have been an Algonquin. So let's rule on that. So they really didn't, and they gave me the lesser form of Indian status, 6-2. So what ended up happening was, like the Sharon McIver case, the charter failed me, and the court failed me. Anyways, there's still a few problems there with that.
Well, sure, I hear you. Let's put up another picture here. Sheldon, can I get you to put up picture number 3? Because as you point out, the court didn't agree with your argument, and you appealed. And what happened with the appeal?
So when we were in the Superior Court level, the judge ruled that my application as a woman was being treated the same way as a man's application. And of course, that's ridiculous, right? We're supposed to have equal treatment before and under the law, not just in terms of the administration of my application. Fortunately, there was some errors of law, but also there was some evidence that the Department of Justice refused to disclose. And that was really terrible that happened, because of course, then the judge at the Superior Court level couldn't adjudicate my case, and I'm sure I would have won if that evidence was pushed forward. We managed to push the evidence forward at the Court of Appeal, but it wasn't even heard, because the Court of Appeal ruled on administrative law versus charter law.
So they never ended up hearing the case?
They never heard. They heard the case. Yes, we won at the Court of Appeal, but they didn't. They didn't look at the evidence that the Department of Justice refused to disclose, and they ruled, instead of on charter law, they ruled on administrative law.
And what's your view of that?
I think it was a terrible runaround, a terrible waste of energy and agency. It's typical of the state to do things like that to Indigenous women. I think that they were litigating against children, not just me. I think that the Department of Justice and its methodology of legal positivism lacks morality. I think that a lot of things about that.
Well, I guess this next part of our conversation we're going to call victory with a question mark at the end, because in talking to you, I'm getting the sense that yes, you did experience a victory, but not 1,000%. Where do you see it?
It was hard. It was really hard when the Court of Appeal ruled and they gave me 6-2 status, a lesser form of status. That meant I had to continue to rally and protest. It was also terrible in the sense that it didn't resolve the core issue of Gehl versus Canada. That the reality is that sometimes the man is not known. And that's the reality for a lot of Indigenous women and a lot of young Indigenous women. And so now what they're doing is they're insisting on circumstantial evidence versus accepting the fact that, like in prior to 1985, that in the situation when the man is not around or the man is unknown, the child is a status Indian like that of the mother.
So do you, as we ask the question, victory with a question mark, do you think you've won?
Yes, that's a really good question, and I'm sure you want me to say yes or no, but I have a little story. So what happened in 1985 was, prior to 1985, the way I describe it is the door was open for Indigenous women and children of unknown and unstated paternity. In 1985, they slapped the door shut. And they were ruling it in a way that the children were denied Indian status registration. And so what Gehl versus Canada did was crack the door open a little bit.
See, I'm just going to push back on you a bit there, because on this program, we really don't expect yes or no answers. We often get yes and no answers, because things are, right? Things are never simple. Things are often very complex. What more do you think, therefore, needs to be done to get to an unambiguous yes?
Well, thank you for that clarity about the agenda. I really appreciate that. I think that Canada should be doing the moral thing when it comes to Indigenous children, especially in the context of reconciliation. They should be opening their arms broadly and trying to protect and working and having policy and law that protect Indigenous women and children. And then I would say a concrete yes.
Gotcha. Now, as more people become aware of their indigeneity and may want to reclaim their roots, how much do you believe the Indian Act still stands in their way of their doing that?
So every situation is different, and certainly in my life, the Indian status registration has been important. But my journey into Indigenous knowledge, into Algonquin Indigenous knowledge, I did it without having Indian status registration. So Indigenous knowledge is a paradigm, and it's a concept, and it's a responsibility. But having said that, because I was a non-status Indian, I couldn't participate in meetings with Chief and Council of Pikwakanagan. Now, as a status Indian, I can do that, and I am doing that regarding the issue of the Algonquin land claim process. So it's a yes and no.
Very well. We're used to hearing that around here. Now, the next question is your legal fight over?
No, I'm still in association and in relationship with the Famous Six and with the Feminist Alliance for International Action. And we're still pressuring Canada and the Department of Indian Affairs to do the right thing and have these women and their children registered.
And do you think this is going to end up in the Supreme Court someday?
Well, the issue of absolute unknown wasn't heard. It is very much possible that there's going to be additional court cases regarding sex discrimination in the Indian Act. Yes.
I just have one more question for you, or don't hold me to it. If you say something fabulous, I may want to follow up. But how about this? You've really been through it, right? Like, this has just taken an inordinate amount of your time and effort and energy. And there must have been times along the way, well, I shouldn't assume. Have there been times along the way when you've just wanted to say, to hell with all of it, I'm giving up?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think that the case wasn't about me. It never really was about me. It was about my family, my father, my grandmother. As I moved along deeper into understanding Indigenous politics and Indigenous knowledge, of course, I realized that who I was more than about the Indian Act. But, when do you quit? After 5 years or 10 years or 15 years? And not only that, I really had to think about my responsibility there, that there's a lot of young mothers who couldn't take on a task like I was taking on, or why would I want to stop and lose 10 years of the struggle? So yes, I wanted to give up. It's caused me a lot of heartache. It's been a very miserable process. The book actually talks about different ways that terrible power was imposed on me. So yes, I did want to give up.
But you didn't.
I don't know if that's always good, but in this case.
In this case, it seems to have paid off. The book is called Gehl versus Canada, Challenging Sex Discrimination in the Indian Act, which, as you've just heard over the last 20-plus minutes, has been a problem for a very long time, or certainly had been a problem, and Lynn Gehl's tribulations continue. Lynn, it's so good of you to make time for us here on TVO tonight. Thank you and good luck.
Chimigwech, Steve.
Chimigwech to you. Residential schools sought to eliminate Indigenous identities. The Indian Act seeks to legally define them. And as communities themselves endeavor to carry on their own culturally defined terms, in recent years, some high-profile cases have emerged of people claiming Indigenous ancestry that they did not really have. With us to explore the question of who can claim to be Indigenous, can we welcome, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Williams Lake, British Columbia, with Catherine Hensel. She is founding partner and principal lawyer at Hensel Barristers. In Wakefield, Quebec, Veldon Coburn, professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Ottawa's Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies. And in Ottawa, Ontario, Gahande Horn-Miller, Assistant Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives and a professor at Carleton University. And we're delighted to have you three on this program tonight. Normally, I just fire off a first question to get us going, but I think we ought not to miss a potential educational opportunity here to do the introductions again. And maybe this time you would all be good enough to introduce yourselves in using your Indigenous names and which nation you belong to, and doing it in the language that is consistent with your indigeneity. Let's see how this goes. Catherine, you want to start us off?
Shem Steve, Waikikwe Catherine Hensel Rinsquest. I am Secwepemc, a citizen of the Secwepemc Nation, and I'm actually coming to you from Secwepemc, our territory and our nation.
Wonderful.
Cruikshank.
Veldon Coburn, how about you?
Kwe Miigwech, I'm Veldon Coburn. I'm from the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan, and I'm coming to you live from my own territory here on Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation territory, just outside of Ottawa.
Gahande.
Gahande Yuja, Sakskarde, what ge ni I Ganyakahaga, Neonjodo, what Ganoradun Danazogweko. I'm Gahande Horn Miller, I'm Bear Clan, I'm Ganyakahaga, and I'm a guest here in unceded Algonquin territory.
And the language you just spoke was?
Ganyageha, or also known as Mohawk.
Wonderful. Thank you for indulging me in that. I thought that was an interesting and different way to start our program. All right, let's get started. Catherine, what is the definition of who is Indigenous?
Well, that's a broad question with a bunch of different answers depending on where you're coming from. But I think generally, people who are not only consider themselves to be and identify themselves as members of a nation and a culture, but also are claimed by and acknowledged by the people of that nation and culture, whether it's through their family, the leadership, elders, and have a connection to, if they are able, have a connection to that community and culture. And it varies as well, depending on which nation you're from, which culture, who can claim to be a member. For Secwepemc people, if you have a drop of Secwepemc blood, then you are Secwepemc.
All right, Veldon, is there anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think that, when Catherine mentions that it's something that's who's claimed, I look at it from a political lens, is that these are political communities where we have citizenship. It comes with a set of rights and also attendant responsibilities. But the matter of being claimed, that's something that most nations adhere to themselves. When being claimed, we typically hold identification from the issuing government itself. So the passport, which has become very popular, you used to be able to cross borders through ports of entry into the United States, for example, from Canada with just a driver's license. But in the post 9/11 world, you have to present the documentation issued by the nation that claims you, which is the guarantee, which is now the passport. So you have to be claimed and provided with that sort of guarantee to outside authorities.
Gahande, is there general agreement among the many hundreds of First Nations in Canada as to what constitutes indigeneity?
I think we have multiple similarities within our own traditional governance systems that we use. Of course, as my colleagues here have stated, it is about who claims you, but it's also too about who you are responsible and accountable to, because there's things that you have to live up to in order to be a part of that community, but you have to, in a sense, prove or live up to those responsibilities. And it's a lifelong thing. It's not just a one-off. So if a community is claiming you, then you have to follow through. The whole reason why I said in the beginning of the intro, I wanted to point out was about the fact that I placed myself. And I think that's where the very starting point is. If you go into any Indigenous community as an Indigenous person, the very first question that you are asked is, who's your mother and who's your father? And that is about placing you. That is about who claims you. So when I do my traditional greeting, that's about situating myself and letting those others know who has claimed me, who am I a part of, who is my family, who is my clan, who is my community. And so there's those unspoken things that we do that are common throughout Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations that set the tone and allow us to be placed.
Veldon, maybe let me use an analogy of religion here, and you tell me how far this sort of goes or doesn't go. For example, if somebody wants to convert to Judaism, or they want to convert to Christianity or Catholicism, you go through the process, you do it, and once you've converted, I mean, quote unquote, you're in. Does it work the same way in the Indigenous world?
Well, under the current constraints, it's far more difficult to do that. There are processes for, and in many, even under Indian Act ban systems, where there are custom citizenship and membership codes for people who are racially non-Indigenous, those who might not have blood, to become members and citizens within our nations. I know people who are citizens that have being, brought in, and not through sort of like hokey procedures of adoption, but what we would understand is naturalization, and those procedures had existed before, just as any other political community around the world would have. A good colleague of ours that we work with, Dr. Damien Lee, and he's been very public about it, is racially not at all Indigenous. He's racially a white man, but is a citizen of the Anishinaabe, larger Anishinaabe nation, but for his particular First Nation as well, has been accepted through their custom governance system. So it's not something you could pick up on the fly and self-identify. So there is still the matter of having the institution claim you. So we do see at the outset, when you were giving the introduction, is that people are making these claims, but it's not in accordance with the rules. It's not a soup kitchen, and it's not fast and loose. I can't pick up a book and start, I don't know, picking up and praying to whatever deity it may be and thinking that I am that religion. And or maybe the analogy fails at that point, but I think I'll just leave it at that matter, that there are more rigid rules that entail governance, but unfortunately they've been eroded, and we're trying to rebuild them at these times with our systems of governments.
Right. We'll go on actually to talk later in our conversation about some of the examples that you just referenced, but I guess we should say Damien Lee was adopted by an Indigenous family, which was why he was, I see you nodding, Veldon, which is why he was welcomed in that circumstance. Let me ask Catherine, though, are you recognized at the moment as a member of your First Nation?
I'm recognized, it's my understanding anyway, I'm recognized by the Secwepemc people as Secwepemc. I am not a status Indian. I'm not registered therefore on any banned lists within our territory. None of my antecedents have ever been held status under the Indian Act. We know who our families. When I walk into a Secwepemc gathering or community, I identify who my family is, the family lines that I come from, and I'm thereby recognized. I know my relatives.
But are you not on the list because you grew up so far away from Secwepemc territory?
No, there's people outside of our territory who are on the list, and I certainly have cousins who, have comparable ancestry who have sought and obtained Indian status. It's a choice 3-4 generations ago within my family to not necessarily move outside the territory initially. They did eventually, but to step outside of that system as it was being set up in our territory. And to the best of my knowledge, none of my direct antecedents or ancestors ever held Indian status. So
and are you trying to claim that status now?
No. There's my citizenship is between me and my people and my nation, and I don't consider it subject to the discretion of a minister, Canadian member of cabinet. As you saw with Lynn Gehl's story, the rules applied to it are arbitrary, or not even arbitrary in some cases. Kind of a sinister colonial construct. I don't really want to make my grandchildren's identity and citizenship subject to that system.
Okay, let's play a clip at this stage here, because we want to do a plug for a TVO original series called Unsettled, which is the story of a woman who was taken from her Northern Ontario territory during the 60s scoop She found her family. She is trying to, quote unquote, reclaim her ancestry. So let's have a look at that clip. Sheldon, if you would.
First, I want to thank my mother, Molly, for never giving up hope. I think your prayers gave me the strength to go on this journey and find my way back home. Also, miigwech to all of you for being here and supporting my family as we begin this journey together. I was very lucky. I grew up in a loving home, and I have 2 beautiful children.
You're not welcome here.
Okay, that's from Unsettled. Airs Sunday, 9 p.m. Or, of course, you can go to our website, tvo.org, follow the searches, and watch it anytime on your own. Okay, Gahande, if someone wants to reclaim their Indigenous ancestry, should they?
Boy, that's a big question. It's a loaded question. I think that, you know, traditionally, we're not in a position right now, I think, within our own communities to answer that question fully. You know, with the implications of the Indian Act system on our traditional governance practices, it has deeply eroded the systems that we already had in place many generations ago to address these kinds of issues. I think that there's a lot of disunity in our communities that comes out of the implications of what we've experienced through time with the issue of the imposition of another system of governance on our peoples.
Just help us understand why that
that's a very
question is so
difficult question.
fraught. Yeah, help us understand why that's such a fraught question.
Because it relates to the issue of money, and it relates to the issue of land and territory and sovereignty. And we're in such a state right now that we are in no way ready to answer that. You know, right now, we are just, you know, struggling to address questions around missing and murdered Indigenous women. We're struggling to address issues of, you know, addictions, survival, the very issue of survival in our own communities, clean water. And the identity question is something that is there. It's been there for a long time, and it's a very difficult one to answer. But there's many other things that are pressing on the ground that we need to address. And this whole identity question just adds to that mess, is what I would call it.
It's certainly a very complex issue, as Drew Hayden Taylor, the playwright, described in his recent piece in the Globe and Mail. Veldon is smiling already because he knows where we're going next. So let me read an excerpt from that column, and then we're going to come back and chat. Sheldon, the graphic, if you would. Most people, he wrote, in the Indigenous community are actually not fond of the quote-unquote blood quantum issue, or the degree to which an individual can prove a certain amount of Indigenous blood. It's unreliable and misleading, but many believe it's still better than nothing. You have to start somewhere. Let's unpack this. Veldon, blood quantum, what is that?
It's a really insidious form of constructing an arbitrary cutoff on who's Indigenous and who's not. So for the longest time, and even there's sort of in a de facto way, the Indian Act has a blood quantum. It doesn't come out and explicitly say it. So basically it is a quantum. It's a quantum measurement of blood. It could be expressed in percentages or fractions, so degrees of being mixed. In the Indian Act, as it currently stands from the amendment in 1985, is if you mix, and you know, it's a larger discussion too, but there is a calculus behind it. If you mix too many times, and what we understand now being the second generation cutoff, you know, so if you have like a status Indian who mixes, there's 2 generations of mixing with non-status, that's the end of it for status itself. But you know, you'll hear sort of turns of phrases of being I'm a full-blooded Indian, or I'm half, or they may be off the cuff themselves, but when they're worked into citizenship codes and membership, or at least the statutes and the laws that are imposed upon us by the state, it's very insidious. It's what you might call, and it's used another turn of phrase amongst ourselves, arithmetic genocide, is that it just basically creates the terminal end of when you've breeded yourself out of existence.
Catherine, what's your view on it?
Yeah, I agree. Like, in order to continue to exist as peoples, you need a bunch of things. You need territory, you need culture, you need language, but first and foremost, you need people. And the Indian Act status regime is systematically and methodically and intentionally reduces the number of people down to nothing in some cases. So as I said earlier, I don't want to make either my own citizenship, my children's citizenship, or my nation's ability to claim us subject to that. And the path, of course, is for nations to reclaim jurisdiction, exclusive jurisdiction, about how they define citizenship, and the rights and obligations that come from citizenship. And it'll be different. Like, I know with Haudenosaunee nations and the citizenship regimes around there, they're very different than what I think the Secwepemc citizenship system and law and jurisdiction, how that would be exercised. And that's as it should be. We are different people. We have different laws.
You mentioned, Catherine, that language ought to be a part of it, and I know you are, at least I think I know, you're trying to learn Secwepemc right now, or Secwepemc Sin, as the language is called.
Chin, yeah.
Chin.
Yeah.
How are you managing?
I'd say, they say for a language like Secwepemc Chin, for an English speaker, it's about 5,000 hours. And I believe that to be true. I'm probably about 1,000 hours in, let's put it that way.
So you got a way to go.
I'm a toddler, linguistically, I'd say.
Gahande, you sounded absolutely perfectly fluent in your language when I asked you to introduce yourself off the top. How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, I spoke only Gonyogeha until I was 5 or 6. And when my mother moved us to Ottawa for work, we were placed into the school system that forced us to begin to learn French and English. And I lost a lot of my language. But since I started having children, I've taken the time to begin to reenact the language in my family. And so that legacy of the language is still there. So I can read it and I can pronounce it. And but the actual memorization of certain terminology and concepts is still very difficult for me. But it's there. And that's why I sound quite fluent, because I'm getting there.
How interested or not are your children in picking this up as well?
Very interested. My eldest is fluent speaker. And my other two, one of them has a child and she's beginning to practice it with her daughter. And then my youngest is beginning to see an interest in it.
Okay. Veldon, let me ask you about a case that you're researching right now. Membership with your own First Nation, which involves the city of Ottawa as well. Big treaty, membership of more than 1,000 people. What's happening with all of that?
So this will go to the question of ancestry and who can claim to be members of political communities for exercising rights and modifying territorial title. So as Catherine says, nations, and it's basically the international Westphalian model too, of nations of having jurisdiction over a people within a bounded territory. So constituting the body politic, who are the citizens, they're the ones that have the rights to modify and make sort of changes to how they constitute themselves. This is the sort of same thing that goes all around the world. For example, and just to preface what's going on in the Algonquin Nation in Ontario, because it is the largest modern treaty in Ontario's history, very close to concluding within a couple of years anyways, and 38 years underway, 30 years of negotiations at the moment for 36,000 square kilometers, is that we have individuals who are claiming to be Algonquin solely for the purposes of modifying Algonquin territorial title. Because it's unceded, we've never had a territorial treaty. We may have diplomacy treaties with the Crown from several centuries ago, but nothing that modifies the territory. And when I think about what they're doing, is they have individuals coming out of the woodwork claiming an ancestor from the 1600s, and that being sufficient to extinguish and modify my rights and our collective title. Now, I also have a great-grandfather that's, well, 3 times great-grandfather that married one of my great-great-grandmothers from Scotland. And a few years ago, I that was an insufficient basis for me to modify or participate in their independence referendum. And that was a significant move that a citizen can take and engage with the state to modify territorial integrity and their relations with other nations. So what we have here is a number of individuals coming out. And in fact, the research that we had done showed that they were forging documents from the 19th and 18th century, so early 1800s, late 1700s. And there's a number of individuals that are reliant upon this, over 1,000. The number is actually much higher now, but my little community has been drowned out in democratic numbers when it comes time to ratifying the final agreement, because they did ratify the agreement in principle in 2016, the culmination of 25 years of negotiations. Which
okay, let me jump in with a follow-up then. If these descendants are legally recognized, what do you think's at stake?
Well, the ability to maintain ourselves as a nation with a recognized territorial foundation for us. We're not sovereignists and we're not separatists. We still want to exercise our rights, but as it's going, those individuals that come out, they vote overwhelmingly to extinguish our rights and title. So it'll be ceding it to the crown. And
Gahande, I suspect there are many white people watching us right now who assume that there are great benefits to having a status card. And I wonder if you could weigh in on that and tell us if that is in fact the case.
It's just a card. Many people think that the card gives you great benefits in terms of tax reductions and whatnot. It really doesn't. Like anybody else, I pay taxes. I work here in Ottawa at Carleton University. That card really doesn't help me in terms of reducing, purchase price on items and things like that. And to me, that tax card is a symbol of colonial occupation. It's a symbol of the oppression of our people. And we are forced to take that. We are forced to apply for these cards and prove who we are in that system, in that other system. But it really doesn't do very much. And it seems to have a lot of weight in terms of non-Indigenous eyes and those who covet them.
All right, let me introduce another controversy that has been all over the media of late, and that has to do with Carrie Bourassa, noted health researcher, University of Saskatchewan. She is currently on leave because the Métis ancestry that she claimed to have is now being questioned. And I want to go back to Drew Hayden-Taylor, again, writing in the Globe and Mail in that same article. He said, people, settlers, if I must be blunt, show up and casually assume the mantle of indigeneity, sometimes even more successfully than those they imitate. That's what riles up our people. Just because you might know how to dance at an intertribal, make a decent bannock, that's a kind of bread, and get beaten up by the police doesn't make you Indigenous. It's so much more than that. To me, indigeneity is a combination of both nature and nurture. Let's unpack that. Catherine, what do you think he meant by all that?
That you do see, particularly in professional circles, academic circles, and in the arts, people who have claimed, as it appears Dr. Bourassa has done, claimed an indigeneity that's vague and turns out to be inaccurate. And it's because the foundational premise is inaccurate and untrue, everything you build on top of it doesn't matter how much you learn. Everything you build on top of it is built on that really shaky, illegitimate foundation. So it means that the identity that you've built for yourself professionally, academically, and personally in a lot of cases, it's based on a lie. And that's very problematic. It's problematic for the people who you're claiming to be a member, or where you claim citizenship. It's problematic for other Indigenous people. And I think it's first and foremost problematic for the individual, for the actual individual. It's the structure that they built their life around has no integrity. And that's a huge problem for them.
Veldon, I'm not sure how to put this other than to ask, are there people in your experience who kind of fetishize indigeneity?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't it's difficult to comment on the personality type, but you see them substitute the sort of skillful emulation, the parody and caricature that they produce for themselves of just almost as exactly what Drew had mentioned in his article is they become skillful performances, a whole production with oftentimes really fraudulent personas that they develop for themselves with a fraudulent backstory. And the arts and academia are particularly bad. Their institutions are so spectacularly poor at understanding and just accepting anyone that it embraces charlatans. So you can have skillful individuals who are deceiving other people, making these brazen misrepresentations of what it involves to be Indigenous. So no matter what sort of food or dress they put on, like they put on the feathers and the leather, and they think that's enough, that they can convince others. But it goes back to the idea of claiming or interfering with the distribution of benefits and burdens, especially the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples, like I mentioned the Algonquins here, but it goes on elsewhere too. So claiming rights which they don't really have, and furthering the colonialism of Indigenous peoples.
Well, you say it goes on elsewhere, and it does remind me of the example, I can't remember how many years ago now, maybe 10, where a woman who was the head of the NAACP was white, but claimed she was black because she felt black and she headed a black organization. And, Catherine, the answer to this question may be obvious, but why do you find that so problematic?
Well, as I said earlier, it's based on something that is just factually untrue. And it's also a manifestation of absolute privilege to think that as a member of the dominant culture, the colonizing culture, that you can just step in and claim for your own that which does not belong to you, does not belong to your family, and then get the benefits that is in the sense of belonging and identity without actually the accountability. In the case of Indigenous people, we are deeply, deeply accountable to our people, to our nations, and within our territories and outside of them. That's what I believe anyway. And if you don't have that accountability, then you certainly shouldn't be claiming any entitlement.
Gotcha. Gahande, are you seeing more people in your experience legitimately trying to connect with whatever indigeneity they have in themselves?
I am. I receive messages through Facebook often from people, family, people who say they're part of my family, the Wide Horn family or the Miller family, and they want to know who they are. I think that's one of the things that we're grappling with here, is that people are wanting a place to belong. Even Europeans who came here are dispossessed from their own lands, and claiming another identity or claiming an identity is part of that effort to belong somewhere. And Indigenous peoples, we have a long history. We have traditions. We have ceremonies. We have stories that place us here, and we know who we are, and we know where we belong. And people want a little piece of that. On the other side of things, you have those who want access to the large funds that are made available to Indigenous people to go to school, living on reserve, access to funding for housing, things like that. I mean, it's not a great story there, but I think those are the two things that we're grappling with is the two different ideas around claiming and access to money.
Having said that, Veldon, how much do you worry about the future of First Nations in Canada if current rules mean that fewer people are going to have citizenship in the future?
Well, we're examining that right now in my own community, the Algonquins Pikwakanagan. So part of the modern treaty negotiations have opened up to explore self-government, and one of the proposals being put forward is a new citizenship code, which wouldn't be reliant upon necessarily, proving some sort of blood quantum or Indian status. So getting rid of that and having a non-terminal sort of generation is that you wouldn't ever breed yourself out of existence, because as it stands, the demographic projections for my little small community of 3,200 status Indians, it's going to decline, and we will cease to exist probably by the end of the century, perhaps, with the rate of what they would call, and use air quotes around it, out marriage, as it were. So having non-status produce offspring and progeny with our membership. So yeah, it's the eventuality that was worked into the whole calculus of things.
Catherine, we've got
it's
about
a very, very problematic issue.
Indeed.
I just want to point out something that, we do have mechanisms in our traditional governance systems to address these issues. For example, in the Gayinarikoa, we have the adoption procedures that ask you to learn how to be accountable to the community of people, to the clan that adopts you. It takes 3 generations for someone to come back in and their descendants learn the language, learn the culture, learn the ceremonies, all of these things that strengthen the community as a whole. And, we have those mechanisms. They're already there. They've been used in the past, and they've been erased through colonization. I think it's the time is now to re-engage with our traditional ways and see where can we make this fit? How can we make this work within this century?
That feels like a great place to leave this discussion. I want to thank the 3 of you for coming in tonight and helping us understand all of these very complicated issues so much better. Catherine Hensel, Veldon Coburn, Gahande Horn-Miller. I'm grateful to the 3 of you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Coming up Thursday on the agenda.
More than $5,000 was ripped out of the pockets of low-wage workers when this government, upon being elected 3 years ago, reversed a planned change to the minimum wage. They dragged workers backwards, and we still aren't back to where we would have been in 2018. Because of inflation eating away, of course, but also because there were other provisions like equal work for equal pay for temp workers, paid sick time permanently in the law. This doesn't even get us back to where working people were 3 years ago.
That's Thursday on the agenda. And that is the agenda for Tuesday, November 23rd, 2021. Policing in this province and everywhere faces new scrutiny. Tomorrow we'll explore why reform seems so elusive. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.